Hello, dear listeners. You are listening to the English Globe, and I truly hope you are doing well today. And before we begin, I want you to pause for a moment and imagine a situation that may sound distant, but is becoming increasingly real in today's world. Because picture yourself scrolling through your phone early in the morning and suddenly noticing that every major news platform is talking about rising tensions in the Middle East, military forces being placed on alert, urgent diplomatic meetings taking place behind closed doors, and experts around the world beginning to speak more carefully about what might happen next. And even without fully understanding every detail, you can feel that this is not just another ordinary headline, but a signal that something larger, more complex, and potentially more serious is slowly unfolding.
Yes, Adam. And what makes this situation even more important is the growing sense that these developments are not isolated or temporary. Because when we hear about increasing military readiness, strategic warnings, and strong political language coming from different countries at the same time, it creates a feeling that the situation is moving beyond normal disagreements and entering a phase where every decision becomes more sensitive and more impactful. And this is exactly why many people across the world are beginning to ask deeper questions, not only about what is happening right now, but also about what these developments could mean in the near future.
That is absolutely right, Julia, because what we are seeing today is not just a single event, but a series of connected developments that are taking place in one of the most strategically important regions in the world. And when tensions rise in such a region, the effects are rarely limited to local boundaries, because global powers, economic systems, and international partnerships are all closely linked, which means that even a small shift in this environment can create reactions that spread far beyond the original point of tension. And this is why people everywhere are paying attention, even if they are thousands of kilometers away from the region itself.
And this naturally brings us to a very important question that many of our listeners might already be thinking about. Because when tensions continue to rise and multiple countries begin to respond in different ways, it raises the possibility of a larger and more complex situation. So, Adam, do you think that what we are seeing right now is simply another regional conflict that will eventually stabilize, or are we possibly witnessing the early stages of something that could expand into a much wider global issue involving multiple powerful nations?
That question is truly at the center of our discussion today, Julia, because this episode is not about creating fear or making dramatic predictions, but about carefully examining the situation with a calm and analytical perspective. And when we talk about the possibility of escalation, we are really talking about how different factors such as political decisions, military strategies, historical tensions, and international relationships can interact with each other in ways that are not always obvious at first. And understanding these connections is essential if we want to see the bigger picture rather than focusing only on individual headlines.
I completely agree, Adam, because one of the most important things to remember is that the modern world is highly interconnected, and this means that events taking place in one region can quickly influence other parts of the world through economic systems, diplomatic relations, and global communication networks. And when we consider the role of countries involved in this situation, along with their strategic interests and long-term goals, it becomes clear that this is not simply about conflict, but about influence, security, and the balance of power in an increasingly complex international environment.
Exactly, Julia. And that is why it is very important for our listeners to understand that in today's episode, our goal is not to support any side or to predict specific outcomes, but to provide a clear and balanced explanation of what is happening, why it matters, and how it could potentially develop over time. Because responsible discussion requires us to focus on facts, context, and careful analysis, rather than emotional reactions or quick assumptions, and by doing so, we can help our listeners build a deeper and more meaningful understanding of global events.
And I think this approach is especially helpful for English learners, because when you listen to discussions like this, you are not only practicing your listening skills, but also learning how complex global topics are explained in clear and structured English. And this helps you become more confident in understanding international conversations, following news discussions, and expressing your own ideas about important issues, which makes your learning experience both practical and engaging at the same time.
That is a very valuable point, Julia. And I would also like to remind our listeners that behind every major global headline, there are multiple layers of meaning that go beyond the surface. Because international events are shaped by history, strategy, and long-term interests. And when we take the time to explore these layers carefully, we begin to see how different elements connect with each other, forming a much larger picture that helps us understand not only what is happening, but also why it is happening and what it might lead to in the future.
Absolutely, Adam. And this is why asking thoughtful questions is so important, because instead of reacting quickly to headlines, we should take a step back and try to analyze the situation from different perspectives. And when we do that, we begin to realize that global events are rarely simple, and that understanding them requires patience, attention, and a willingness to explore deeper connections between different countries, decisions, and outcomes.
So, dear listeners, as we begin this important conversation, we would like to invite you to be an active part of this journey, because your engagement not only helps you improve your English skills, but also allows you to think more critically about the world around you. And if you find this type of content helpful and interesting, do not forget to like this video, subscribe to the English Globe, and share your thoughts with us in the comments, because your ideas and questions help us create more meaningful and valuable content for you.
And as we move forward in this episode, let us keep one key idea in mind, because the goal of this discussion is not to create fear or uncertainty, but to build understanding. And by exploring the facts, the context, and the possible directions of this situation, we hope to give you a clearer and more balanced perspective on what is happening and why it matters.
Because in the end, understanding global events is not just about knowing the headlines, but about seeing the deeper connections that shape our world. And that is exactly what we are going to explore together step by step in today's episode. To understand what is happening right now, we need to take a calm and structured look at the latest developments. Because when people hear about rising tensions, they often imagine a single dramatic event. But in reality, the current situation involving Iran is the result of multiple developments happening over time, including increasing political pressure, strong public statements from different governments, visible military preparedness in certain areas, and growing uncertainty across the region, which together create an environment where even small actions can gain significant attention and lead to wider reactions from other countries that are closely observing every move.
Yes, Adam, and one of the most important things for our listeners to understand is that this situation did not begin suddenly, because tensions in the Middle East often develop gradually through a series of events. And when we look at the current moment, we can see that there have been signals such as diplomatic disagreements, warnings from officials, and shifts in regional security conditions, all of which contribute to a situation where countries begin to prepare themselves more carefully, not necessarily because a large conflict has already started, but because they want to be ready for different possible outcomes.
That is exactly right, Julia. And when we talk about what has triggered the current escalation, we are not referring to just one single cause, but rather a combination of factors that have increased pressure over time, including strategic disagreements between countries, concerns about security and influence in the region, and reactions to specific incidents that may have raised tensions further. And while not every detail is always fully confirmed or publicly explained, what we can observe clearly is a pattern of increasing caution, stronger language in official statements, and visible efforts by different countries to protect their interests.
And I think it is helpful to simplify this for our listeners by focusing on who is involved, because sometimes the situation can feel confusing when many countries are mentioned at once. So in simple terms, we have Iran as a central actor in this situation, along with other countries that are either directly involved through political or military positioning, or indirectly involved by monitoring the situation, making diplomatic statements, or adjusting their strategies based on what might happen next. And this creates a network of interactions where each decision can influence the behavior of others.
Exactly, Julia. And it is also important to understand that not every country involved is acting in the same way, because some may take a more direct role by increasing their military readiness or making strong public statements. while others may focus more on diplomacy, communication, and efforts to reduce tension. And this difference in approach shows us that the global response is not uniform, but rather shaped by each country's priorities, interests, and long-term goals, which adds another layer of complexity to the situation.
And this is where many people begin to feel uncertain, because when they hear about military movements or see reports of increased alert levels, it can sound very serious. But it is important to remember that such actions are often part of precautionary measures rather than immediate steps toward large-scale conflict. And governments sometimes increase readiness to send signals, to protect their positions, or to prepare for different scenarios, which means that these actions should be understood within a broader context rather than viewed in isolation.
That is a very important point, Julia, because one of the key challenges in understanding global events is distinguishing between preparation and action. And in many cases, what we are seeing now falls into the category of preparation, where countries are carefully observing each other, adjusting their positions, and communicating their intentions through both words and actions. And while this can increase tension, it does not automatically mean that a larger conflict is inevitable, but rather that the situation is sensitive and requires careful management.
And for our listeners, it is also useful to understand that political statements play a significant role in shaping how situations develop. Because when leaders speak publicly about security concerns, warnings, or expectations, their words can influence how other countries respond, and sometimes even a strong statement can lead to reactions that increase tension further, which is why communication between countries becomes extremely important during such periods of uncertainty.
Absolutely, Julia. And this is why we must approach this topic with clarity and responsibility. Because while it is natural to feel concerned when hearing about rising tensions, it is equally important to focus on what is actually known and observable, rather than jumping to conclusions. And at this stage, what we can clearly say is that the situation is evolving, with multiple factors influencing its direction, and that decisions made by different countries in the coming days or weeks could play a key role in shaping what happens next.
And I think that idea of the situation evolving is very important, because it reminds us that nothing is fixed at this moment, and that there are still many possible directions this situation could take, including efforts to reduce tension, continued caution without major escalation, or further developments that may require closer attention. And by understanding that the situation is dynamic, our listeners can develop a more balanced and informed perspective instead of reacting to every headline as a final outcome.
So as we continue this discussion, it is important to keep in mind that what we are observing right now is a developing situation shaped by multiple actors, different strategies, and ongoing communication. And by focusing on clear information, careful analysis, and a structured understanding of events, we can begin to see the bigger picture without becoming overwhelmed by uncertainty, which will help us move forward into the next part of our discussion with a stronger foundation. When we begin to ask why this conflict is receiving so much global attention, we must first understand that the Middle East is not just another region on the map, but one of the most strategically important areas in the world, because it sits at the center of major energy routes, international trade pathways, and critical geographic connections that link Asia, Europe, and Africa. And this unique position means that any instability in this region does not remain limited to nearby countries, but instead has the potential to influence global systems in ways that are both immediate and long-term, especially when it comes to energy supply and economic stability.
Yes, Adam. And I think many of our listeners may have heard that the Middle East is important for oil, but it is helpful to understand what that really means in a global context, because oil is not just a resource used by a few countries, but a key part of the global economy that affects transportation, industry, and daily life in almost every part of the world. And when there is tension in a region that plays a major role in supplying this energy, it creates uncertainty in global markets, which can lead to changes in prices, shifts in economic planning, and increased concern among governments that depend on stable energy flows.
That is exactly right, Julia. because energy supply is one of the main reasons why countries far from the Middle East still pay very close attention to what happens there. And when tensions rise, even the possibility of disruption to oil routes or production can influence decisions in countries that rely on imports, which shows us how deeply connected the global economy has become. Because a situation in one region can quickly create reactions in financial markets, policy decisions, and even everyday costs for people living thousands of kilometers away.
And beyond energy, Adam, there is also the question of geography, because the Middle East is located at a crossroads of major international routes, including important shipping lanes that are used for transporting goods between continents. And when a region with such a central position experiences instability, it raises concerns about the safety and reliability of these routes, which can affect global trade, supply chains, and the movement of essential goods, making the impact of the situation much broader than it might first appear.
Exactly, Julia, and this brings us to a very important concept, which is the idea that in today's world, no major conflict exists in isolation, because global systems are deeply interconnected through trade, communication, and political relationships. And this means that when a conflict develops in a key region, it can create a chain reaction that affects multiple countries in different ways, including economic adjustments, diplomatic responses, and strategic planning, all of which show us that the effects of such a situation extend far beyond the immediate area of tension.
And this is why even countries that are not directly involved begin to show concern, because they understand that the consequences of instability can reach them through different channels, whether it is through higher energy costs, changes in trade conditions, or shifts in global security dynamics. And this awareness leads governments to monitor the situation closely, make careful decisions, and sometimes adjust their policies in response to what is happening, even if they are not physically present in the region.
That is an important point, Julia, because when we talk about global connections, we are really talking about a system where actions in one place can influence reactions in many others. And this is especially true in a highly globalized world where economies are linked. Information travels instantly, and decisions are often made with international consequences in mind. And this interconnected nature of the modern world is one of the main reasons why conflicts in strategically important regions receive such widespread attention.
Absolutely, Adam. And I think it is also important for our listeners to understand that globalization has changed the way we experience international events. Because in the past, a conflict might have remained more localized, but today with global communication, economic interdependence, and shared challenges, events in one region can quickly become topics of discussion, concern, and action across the entire world, which makes understanding these connections even more important.
Exactly, Julia, and this is why we must approach this topic with a broader perspective, because when we look at the current situation involving Iran and rising tensions in the Middle East, we are not just looking at a regional issue, but at a situation that has the potential to influence global systems, affect international relationships, and shape economic conditions in ways that matter to people everywhere. And by understanding this bigger picture, we can better appreciate why the world is paying such close attention.
And in the end, Adam, what this shows us is that global awareness is not just about following the news, but about understanding how different parts of the world are connected, and why events in one region can have consequences that reach far beyond their starting point, which is why discussions like this are so important, because they help us move beyond simple headlines and develop a deeper understanding of the world we live in.
And that deeper understanding is exactly what we aim to build in this episode, because by exploring not only what is happening but also why it matters globally, we can begin to see the connections that shape our world, and this will help us continue our discussion with a clearer and more informed perspective as we move forward. As we move deeper into understanding this situation, it becomes very important to clearly identify the key players involved, because without knowing who is part of this complex environment and what their interests are, it becomes difficult to understand why tensions rise or how decisions are made. And when we look at the current situation, we can see that Iran stands as a central actor, not only because of its geographic position in the Middle East, but also because of its political influence, regional connections, and long-term strategic goals, which together shape how it responds to pressure how it communicates with other countries, and how it positions itself in a rapidly changing international environment.
Yes, Adam. And to make this easier for our listeners, we can think of Iran as one of the main countries whose actions and decisions are directly connected to the current developments, but at the same time, it is also important to understand that Iran is not acting alone in a simple situation because its decisions are influenced by both internal priorities and external pressures. And this means that when we talk about Iran's role, we are really talking about a country that is trying to balance security, influence, and stability while responding to a complex network of regional and global relationships.
That is absolutely correct, Julia. And alongside Iran, we must also consider the role of the United States, which is another major actor in this situation, because of its global influence, military capabilities, and long-standing involvement in international affairs, especially in regions that are strategically important. And when we look at the United States in this context, we can understand that its actions are often shaped by a combination of factors such as maintaining regional stability, protecting its interests, supporting its partners, and managing broader global responsibilities, which makes its role both significant and carefully calculated.
And this is where things become more interesting, Adam, because when people hear about two major countries being involved, they often think in terms of direct confrontation. But in reality, the situation is usually much more complex, because there are also regional allies that play important roles. And these can include countries that are geographically close to the situation and have their own security concerns, political priorities, and strategic interests, which means that their involvement may be influenced by both local dynamics and their relationships with larger global powers.
Exactly, Julia, and these regional allies often act in ways that reflect their own goals, which may include maintaining stability within their borders, protecting economic interests, or responding to regional challenges. And this adds another layer to the situation, because now we are not just looking at one or two countries, but at a network of actors whose decisions can influence each other, creating a dynamic environment where cooperation, caution, and competition all exist at the same time.
And beyond the directly involved countries, we also have global powers that are observing the situation very closely, even if they are not taking direct action. Because in today's interconnected world, major international actors understand that developments in one region can affect global stability, economic conditions, and diplomatic relationships. And this means that even countries that are not physically involved may still play an important role through their policies, statements, and strategic decisions.
That is a very important point, Julia, because when we talk about these global powers, we are often referring to countries that have significant economic influence, political reach, and international responsibilities. And their approach to such situations is usually shaped by a desire to protect global stability, avoid unnecessary escalation, and maintain a balance that supports long-term interests, which means that their influence is often indirect but still highly impactful.
And I think it is also important to highlight for our listeners that not all countries involved in this situation are seeking conflict. Because while tensions may be rising, many nations are focused on maintaining stability, reducing risk, and preventing escalation. And this shows us that the international environment is not simply divided into opposing sides, but is instead made up of different perspectives, priorities, and strategies that aim to manage a complex situation in different ways.
Exactly, Julia. And this is where the difference between direct involvement and indirect influence becomes very important, because some countries may be directly involved through visible actions such as military readiness or strong political statements, while others may influence the situation through diplomacy, economic decisions, or strategic communication. And understanding this difference helps us see that power is not only expressed through direct action, but also through careful positioning and long-term planning.
And when we begin to understand these different roles, Adam, it becomes easier to see why the situation is so complex, because each country is making decisions based on its own interests, but at the same time, those decisions are connected to the actions of others, creating a system where everything is linked, and where even small changes can lead to larger reactions across the international stage.
And that interconnected system is exactly what makes this topic so important to analyze carefully. Because when we understand who the key players are and what motivates them, we can move beyond simple assumptions and begin to see the deeper structure of global events, which will help us continue our discussion with greater clarity and a stronger understanding of how international relations actually work in practice. When we try to understand how a situation moves from simple tension to a potential crisis, it is important to look at escalation as a process that usually develops step by step, rather than appearing suddenly, because in most cases conflicts grow through a sequence that begins with political disagreements, where countries express opposing views on issues such as security, influence, or regional stability. And these disagreements may initially remain at the level of dialogue, statements, or diplomatic exchanges. But over time, if they are not resolved or managed effectively, they can create an environment where each side begins to adjust its posture in response to the other, gradually increasing the level of seriousness in their actions and communications.
Yes, Adam. And this step-by-step development is something that many people may not notice at first, because from the outside, it can seem like events are happening quickly. But when we look more carefully, we see that there are often warning signs along the way, such as changes in tone in official statements, increased attention to security concerns, or discussions about preparedness. And these signals indicate that the situation is moving from simple disagreement toward a more sensitive phase, where each decision carries more weight and may influence how other countries respond in return.
As the process continues, the next stage often involves military warnings or demonstrations of readiness, which do not necessarily mean that conflict is inevitable, but rather that countries are showing their capability and intention to protect their interests if needed. And these actions can include movements of forces, exercises, or strategic positioning, which are typically designed to send a message of caution or deterrence. And in this stage, the situation becomes more complex because actions that are meant to prevent conflict can sometimes be interpreted by others as signs of preparation for escalation, depending on perspective and interpretation.
That is where understanding becomes very important, Adam, because when countries interpret each other's actions differently, it can create misunderstandings. And these misunderstandings may lead to responses that were not originally intended, which is why communication and clarity are essential in reducing the risk of escalation, especially in situations where trust is limited or where historical experiences influence how messages are received. And this shows us how important it is for countries to consider not only what they do, but also how their actions might be perceived by others.
Following military warnings, the next phase in escalation can involve limited actions, which are controlled responses that may be designed to achieve specific objectives without expanding the situation into a broader conflict. And these actions are often carefully calculated to avoid crossing certain boundaries. But even limited actions can have significant consequences, because they may trigger reactions from other countries, leading to a cycle where each side responds to the other's moves, gradually increasing the level of involvement and attention from additional actors who may begin to take interest in the situation as it develops.
And at this stage, Adam, the risk of miscalculation becomes more noticeable, because when countries respond to limited actions, they must make decisions based on incomplete information, time pressure, and strategic considerations. And sometimes a response that is intended to remain limited may be interpreted as a step toward escalation, which can influence how others react, creating a situation where each side is trying to manage both their own objectives and the possible reactions of others at the same time, which requires careful judgment and clear understanding of the situation.
As escalation continues, there is also the possibility that limited actions may lead to wider involvement, especially if additional countries begin to respond, either directly or indirectly, through political support, strategic partnerships, or other forms of engagement. And this is where a regional situation can start to gain broader international attention. Because once more actors become involved, the number of interactions increases, and the situation becomes more complex, with each new participant bringing their own interests, concerns, and strategies into the overall dynamic.
Yes, Adam. And this is why escalation is often described as gradual rather than sudden, because each step builds on the previous one. And even though it may seem like events are accelerating, they are actually following a pattern where decisions are influenced by earlier developments. And understanding this pattern helps us see that crises do not usually appear overnight, but instead develop through a combination of actions, reactions, and interpretations that accumulate over time, shaping the direction of the situation.
Looking at historical patterns also helps us understand this process better, because when we study past conflicts, we often find that small events, such as misunderstandings, isolated incidents, or strategic decisions, have sometimes played a role in triggering larger reactions, not because the events themselves were extremely large, but because they occurred in a sensitive environment where tensions were already present. And this shows us that context matters greatly when evaluating how conflicts can grow, since the same type of event may have different outcomes depending on the surrounding conditions.
And in many of these cases, miscommunication has been one of the key factors, because when messages are unclear, incomplete, or interpreted differently by different sides, it can lead to assumptions that influence decision-making. And these assumptions may not always reflect the true intentions of the other party, which increases the risk of miscalculation, especially in high-pressure situations where decisions must be made quickly and with limited information, highlighting the importance of clarity and careful communication in international relations.
Another important aspect is that escalation often involves a combination of both intention and reaction, where one side may act with a specific goal in mind, but the outcome of that action depends not only on their intention, but also on how others interpret and respond to it. And this interaction between intention and perception is one of the reasons why conflicts can develop in unexpected ways. Because even well-planned actions can produce results that differ from what was originally intended, depending on how they are received by others in the international system.
And this is why understanding escalation requires us to think beyond simple cause and effect. Because in reality, the process is influenced by multiple layers of interaction, including communication, perception, strategy, and timing, all of which work together to shape how situations evolve. And by recognizing these layers, we can better understand why conflicts do not always follow a straight path, but instead move through stages that reflect the complexity of relationships between countries.
In conclusion, escalation from tension to crisis is not a sudden transformation, but a gradual progression that involves several stages, including disagreement, warning, limited action, and potential wider involvement. And at each stage, decisions are influenced by a combination of strategic interests, communication, and perception, which together create a dynamic environment where outcomes are shaped over time rather than determined by a single event. And this understanding allows us to approach global events with a more informed and balanced perspective. When people hear the term World War, it often creates a strong emotional reaction. But in analytical terms, a world war is not defined by intensity alone. It is defined by the scale of involvement, where multiple major global powers become directly engaged in conflict across different regions, rather than remaining limited to a single theater. In historical context, both World War I and World War II involved widespread alliances, direct military participation from major powers, and coordinated strategies that expanded far beyond their initial points of origin. When we look at the current situation involving Iran and the surrounding regional dynamics, it is important to separate localized escalation from a truly global conflict, because not every serious geopolitical tension evolves into a world war, even if it captures global attention.
That distinction is very important, Adam, because from a global audience perspective, any conflict involving a strategically important country can appear larger than it actually is, especially when international media coverage increases and political leaders make public statements. But in reality, the involvement of other major powers such as the United States does not automatically mean direct warfare on a global scale, since engagement can take many forms, including diplomacy, economic pressure, intelligence sharing, or limited military presence that is designed to manage risk rather than escalate it. And understanding these differences helps avoid jumping to conclusions based on incomplete information or early-stage developments.
If we analyze the current situation through a historical lens, one of the key differences between past world wars and today's environment is the presence of established international institutions and communication channels that allow countries to signal intentions, negotiate tensions, and avoid misunderstandings that could otherwise lead to rapid escalation. And while tensions can still rise quickly under certain conditions, modern geopolitical systems are generally structured in a way that encourages containment rather than expansion of conflict, even when disagreements become serious between nations with competing interests.
At the same time, it is natural for people to ask whether global alliances are forming in a way that could resemble the early stages of a broader conflict. But in most cases, alliances today are complex and not always aligned toward war, because many countries prioritize economic stability, regional security, and diplomatic relationships over confrontation, meaning that cooperation and competition often exist at the same time. And this balance makes the international system more interconnected, but also more cautious in how disputes are handled.
Another key factor to consider is that a world war typically requires coordinated involvement from multiple major powers across different regions, not just indirect support or political alignment. And while different countries may have interests, partnerships, or concerns related to events in a specific region, these connections do not necessarily translate into direct military engagement, which is why analysts often emphasize the difference between influence and intervention when assessing the risk level of any ongoing conflict.
So in simple terms, while the situation may be serious and evolving, and while it certainly deserves attention due to its regional and global implications, the presence of tension alone does not meet the criteria of a world war, and understanding this helps maintain a clear and balanced perspective, where we focus on verified developments, observe how relationships between countries evolve over time, and avoid assuming outcomes before the situation has fully developed.
And that is why, instead of asking only whether a world war is happening, it is more accurate to observe how diplomatic efforts, strategic decisions, and communication between nations influence the direction of events, because these elements often determine whether tensions remain contained or expand. And in most modern cases, there is a strong effort by the international community to prevent large-scale escalation.
Ultimately, the key takeaway is that high tension does not automatically equal global war. And while it is essential to stay informed and aware of developments involving Iran, the situation should be understood in context, with attention to facts rather than assumptions, and with recognition that global stability depends on many interconnected decisions made by multiple actors over time.
In any major international situation, the role of global powers becomes a central factor in shaping outcomes, not necessarily through direct military involvement, but through a combination of economic influence, political positioning, and diplomatic engagement, where countries with significant global reach often prefer to manage tensions carefully rather than escalate them, especially when the consequences of direct conflict could affect not only regional stability, but also global markets, alliances, and long-term strategic interests.
That is a key point, Adam, because many people assume that influence only comes from visible military presence, but in reality, global powers often operate through more subtle and structured mechanisms where decisions are made behind diplomatic channels, within international organizations, and through coordinated communication, allowing countries to express positions, support allies, or apply pressure without immediately resorting to force, which helps maintain a level of control over rapidly changing situations.
When we look at major global actors, including countries like the United States, their involvement in international affairs is often guided by long-term strategic considerations rather than short-term reactions, meaning that decisions are evaluated based on potential economic impact, alliance commitments, regional stability, and the risk of unintended escalation, which explains why direct intervention is sometimes avoided in favor of indirect influence or measured engagement.
At the same time, other global powers may choose to maintain a more neutral or balanced position, observing developments while protecting their own national interests, trade relationships, and geopolitical priorities. And this approach allows them to remain flexible, adjust their stance if the situation changes, and avoid being drawn into conflicts that do not directly align with their core objectives or immediate security concerns.
Another important dimension of global power involvement is economic leverage, where tools such as trade policies, financial systems, and international agreements can influence the behavior of states without requiring physical confrontation. And these measures can be used to signal approval, apply pressure, or encourage negotiation, demonstrating that power in the modern world is not limited to military capability alone, but extends into financial and institutional domains.
Yes, and this is where diplomacy plays a critical role, because negotiations, dialogue, and communication between nations often serve as the first line of response when tensions rise, allowing leaders to explore solutions, reduce misunderstandings, and identify common ground, even when their interests are not fully aligned, which helps prevent situations from escalating into larger conflicts.
In addition, alliances and partnerships also influence how global powers respond, since commitments to allied countries may shape policy decisions. But even within alliances, there is often a preference for coordinated restraint rather than immediate escalation, as countries aim to balance support for partners with the broader goal of maintaining international stability and avoiding unnecessary expansion of conflict.
It is also important to understand that global powers may have overlapping interests in certain regions, but those interests do not always translate into unified action, because each country evaluates risks and benefits differently, leading to a range of responses that can include statements of concern, calls for peace, or participation in multilateral discussions rather than direct involvement in conflict scenarios.
When we analyze these patterns together, it becomes clear that influence in international relations operates on multiple levels, where visible actions are only one part of a much larger system that includes strategy, communication, economic tools, and long-term planning, all of which contribute to how global powers shape events without necessarily engaging in open confrontation.
And this layered approach is what often keeps situations from escalating too quickly, because the presence of multiple global actors with different priorities creates a balance of interests, where decisions are carefully weighed and coordinated, reducing the likelihood of abrupt or unplanned actions that could increase tensions further.
Another factor to consider is that global powers often monitor each other closely, not just in terms of military capability, but also in terms of diplomatic signals, policy shifts, and public statements, which means that communication itself becomes a strategic tool, helping countries interpret intentions and adjust their own responses accordingly to avoid misunderstandings.
This interconnected environment shows that international relations today is not a simple system of opposition, but rather a complex network of relationships where cooperation and competition exist side by side, and where global powers must continuously adapt their strategies to changing conditions while maintaining stability in an uncertain environment.
Ultimately, the role of global powers is not defined by a single action or decision, but by a continuous process of engagement, observation, and adjustment, where influence is exercised through a combination of diplomacy, economic measures, and strategic communication, all aimed at managing tensions while protecting national and global interests.
So when we look at the broader picture, it becomes clear that global powers play a stabilizing as well as influential role, and their choices, whether to intervene, negotiate, or observe, contribute significantly to how situations evolve, reinforcing the idea that power in the modern world is as much about restraint and strategy as it is about capability and presence.
When we analyze any major geopolitical tension, one of the first areas to react is the global economy, because financial systems are highly sensitive to uncertainty, and even the perception of instability can influence oil prices, stock markets, and trade flows within a very short period of time, especially when the situation involves regions that play a significant role in energy production and transportation routes that connect different parts of the world.
That is true, Adam. And when people hear about developments involving Iran and surrounding regions, one of the immediate concerns in global markets is the potential effect on oil supply, since the Middle East remains a key area for global energy exports, and any disruption, whether actual or anticipated, can lead to fluctuations in prices as traders and governments adjust their expectations based on risk and supply stability.
Oil markets in particular tend to respond quickly because they are not only influenced by current supply and demand, but also by future expectations, meaning that if investors believe there is a possibility of disruption, prices may rise even before any physical shortage occurs, reflecting a kind of risk premium that gets added during periods of uncertainty, which can then influence transportation costs, manufacturing, and energy consumption across multiple countries.
And when oil prices increase, the effects often extend beyond the energy sector, because transportation, agriculture, and industrial production all rely on fuel in some form, so higher energy costs can gradually affect the price of goods and services, which means that consumers may begin to notice changes in their daily expenses, even if they are far away from the actual region where tensions are occurring.
Another important aspect is trade disruption, where shipping routes, insurance costs, and logistical planning can be affected by instability in key regions, and companies that rely on international supply chains may need to adjust their operations, reroute shipments, or account for additional risks, which can slow down the movement of goods and increase operational costs over time.
Yes, and this is where the interconnected nature of the global economy becomes very visible, because a disruption in one region can influence production schedules in another, and delays in shipping or increased transportation costs can impact everything from raw materials to finished products, creating a chain reaction that affects businesses and consumers across different continents.
Financial markets also tend to react to geopolitical uncertainty, as investors reassess risk and adjust their portfolios, which can lead to short-term volatility in stock indices, currency values, and commodity prices, reflecting the collective response of global participants who are continuously evaluating new information and updating their expectations based on developments as they unfold.
At the same time, central banks and governments often monitor these changes closely, because sustained increases in energy prices or market instability can contribute to inflationary pressure, which affects the overall cost of living and may influence monetary policy decisions aimed at maintaining economic stability and controlling price levels.
Inflation becomes an important factor here, because when the cost of essential goods such as fuel, transportation, and food begins to rise, it can reduce purchasing power, meaning that consumers may need to adjust their spending habits, prioritize essential expenses, and adapt to changes in the economic environment, even if the initial cause of those changes is external to their own country.
For ordinary people, these global developments may feel distant at first, but their effects can gradually appear in everyday life, such as higher prices at fuel stations, increased transportation fares, or changes in the cost of imported goods, which demonstrates how international events can indirectly shape local economic conditions in ways that are often not immediately visible.
Businesses also respond to these changes by adjusting pricing strategies, managing supply chain risks, and exploring alternative sources of energy or materials, which can lead to innovation in some cases, but also create challenges for smaller companies that may have limited flexibility to absorb rising costs or sudden market shifts.
And this is why economic systems are often described as highly responsive, because they are built on continuous interaction between supply, demand, expectations, and external factors, meaning that even small signals from geopolitical events can trigger adjustments across multiple sectors almost simultaneously.
In addition, governments may introduce measures to stabilize markets, support consumers, or manage inflation, depending on the severity of the situation, which highlights the role of policy in maintaining balance during periods of uncertainty, especially when global factors begin to influence domestic economic conditions.
Overall, when we connect all these elements together, it becomes clear that the economic impact of geopolitical tension is not limited to a single industry or region, but instead spreads through interconnected systems that influence energy prices, trade flows, financial markets, and ultimately the daily lives of people around the world.
And that is why understanding the economic dimension is essential, because it helps explain not only what is happening at the international level, but also how those developments translate into real-world consequences that affect individuals, businesses, and economies in both direct and indirect ways. When we try to understand where the current situation may lead, it is important to approach the future as a set of possible scenarios rather than a single predicted outcome. Because international relations are shaped by multiple variables such as political decisions, diplomatic communication, economic pressures, and security considerations, all of which can change over time, and each of these factors can push events in different directions depending on how leaders respond to developments in real time.
Exactly, Adam. And instead of focusing on speculation, it is more useful to outline realistic pathways that are supported by historical patterns and current dynamics, because this allows us to better understand how situations evolve and why certain outcomes become more likely than others as conditions change, especially in a complex environment involving Iran and other regional and international actors.
The first possible scenario is de-escalation through diplomacy, where involved parties choose to reduce tensions by engaging in dialogue, negotiations, and indirect communication, often through intermediaries or international organizations. And this type of outcome is usually influenced by a mutual understanding that prolonged conflict would create greater risks than benefits, particularly in terms of economic stability, regional security, and long-term strategic interests, which encourages countries to seek controlled and measured solutions rather than escalation.
In such a scenario, diplomatic efforts may include ceasefire agreements, confidence-building measures, or structured talks that aim to address specific concerns without requiring immediate resolution of all underlying issues. And while this process can take time and may involve setbacks, it represents a path where communication remains active and priorities are aligned towards stability rather than confrontation.
The second scenario involves continued regional conflict, where tensions persist without expanding into a global confrontation, meaning that the situation remains concentrated within a specific geographic area but continues to experience periods of escalation and de-escalation, often influenced by local dynamics, strategic calculations, and responses from the parties directly involved, which can lead to a prolonged state of instability without necessarily involving broader international escalation.
In this case, the conflict may remain limited in scope but still have significant regional consequences, affecting neighboring countries, trade routes, and security arrangements, while international actors may continue to observe, provide support to allies, or engage in diplomatic efforts aimed at preventing further escalation, showing that even contained conflicts can have wide-reaching implications.
The third scenario is limited international involvement, where external powers may become more actively engaged, but in a controlled and measured way that does not escalate into a large-scale global war. Such involvement could include diplomatic mediation, economic measures, or selective strategic actions designed to influence the situation without direct large-scale confrontation. And this type of engagement is often shaped by careful assessment of risks, alliances, and global stability concerns.
It is important to emphasize that even in this scenario, involvement does not automatically mean widespread conflict, because modern international systems are designed to manage tensions through multiple layers of communication and coordination, allowing countries to respond to developments while still maintaining a balance between action and restraint, especially when global interests are interconnected.
Across all these scenarios, one consistent factor is that outcomes depend heavily on decision-making, where the choices made by political leaders, military advisors, and diplomatic channels play a critical role in determining whether tensions decrease, remain stable, or shift in a new direction, and these decisions are often influenced by both immediate conditions and long-term strategic objectives.
And this highlights why the present moment is so significant, because the actions taken today, whether through negotiation, communication, or policy adjustments, can influence not only the short-term situation, but also the trajectory of future developments, making each decision an important part of a larger process that unfolds over time.
Another key factor is uncertainty, since no scenario unfolds exactly as expected, and unexpected events, miscalculations, or shifts in political priorities can alter the direction of developments, which is why analysts focus on patterns and probabilities rather than fixed predictions, allowing for flexibility in understanding how situations may evolve under different conditions.
Yes, and this uncertainty is also why careful observation and informed analysis are essential, because staying updated with verified information helps create a clearer picture of what is happening, rather than relying on assumptions or incomplete interpretations that may not reflect the actual state of affairs.
When we step back and look at these scenarios together, it becomes clear that the future is shaped by a combination of diplomacy, strategic decisions, and global interactions, where each path remains possible depending on how key actors respond to challenges and opportunities in the coming period.
Ultimately, the importance of these scenarios lies not in predicting a single outcome, but in understanding the range of possibilities, recognizing the role of human decisions in shaping events, and appreciating how interconnected the world has become, where actions taken in one region can influence outcomes far beyond their immediate context.
In today's interconnected world, information itself has become one of the most influential elements in shaping how global conflicts are perceived, understood, and sometimes even interpreted before any official developments fully unfold. And this is especially true in situations involving sensitive geopolitical regions such as Iran, where news spreads rapidly across different platforms, and audiences around the world form opinions based on a continuous flow of updates, headlines, and commentary that may vary in accuracy, tone, and depth. In such an environment, media does not just report events, it also frames them, which means the same situation can appear differently depending on how it is presented, what details are emphasized, and what context is included or omitted.
That framing is very important, Adam, because for many people, especially those who are not directly involved in international relations, their understanding of a conflict often comes entirely from what they see in news reports, social media discussions, or expert analyses. And while these sources can provide valuable information, they can also differ in perspective, which is why it becomes essential to approach information with a balanced mindset, focusing on multiple sources and verifying key facts before forming conclusions about complex global events.
Another aspect to consider is the speed at which information travels today. Because unlike in the past, where news took longer to circulate, modern communication channels allow updates to reach a global audience almost instantly. And while this improves awareness, it also increases the risk of incomplete or premature interpretations, especially during fast-moving situations where facts are still developing and official confirmations may take time to emerge, creating a gap between perception and reality that must be carefully managed.
Yes, and this gap can sometimes lead to misunderstanding or exaggeration, not necessarily because of intentional misinformation, but because early reports may lack full context, or because different sources prioritize different details, which is why critical thinking becomes a valuable skill, helping individuals distinguish between confirmed information, developing situations, and speculative commentary, especially when discussions involve international actors such as the United States and other global stakeholders.
Media coverage also plays a role in shaping public sentiment, as repeated exposure to certain narratives can influence how people emotionally respond to events. And while awareness is important, it is equally important to maintain a clear distinction between information and interpretation, ensuring that conclusions are based on verified data rather than repeated impressions that may not fully represent the complexity of the situation.
In addition, social media platforms have introduced a new layer to global communication, where individuals can share opinions, analyses, and reactions in real time, which contributes to a more dynamic and participatory information environment, but also requires users to be more cautious, since not all content is equally reliable. And the absence of editorial oversight in some cases means that responsibility shifts to the audience to evaluate credibility.
This makes media literacy an essential part of understanding modern global affairs, because being able to assess sources, identify bias, and compare multiple viewpoints allows individuals to build a more complete and accurate understanding of events, rather than relying on a single narrative, which may only represent one angle of a much broader and more complex reality.
At the same time, responsible journalism continues to play a crucial role in providing verified information, context, and analysis that helps audiences make sense of developments, especially in situations where clarity is needed to avoid confusion. And when balanced reporting is combined with careful public interpretation, it contributes to a more informed global community.
Ultimately, the way information is shared and consumed can influence not only public perception, but also broader discussions about international events, which means that clarity, accuracy, and context are just as important as the events themselves when it comes to understanding global conflicts and their potential implications.
And this brings us back to the central idea of this episode. Staying informed is not just about following headlines, but about developing the ability to understand information in context, recognize different perspectives, and remain aware of how media, communication, and global dynamics interact to shape our view of the world.
As we bring this discussion to a close, one of the most important lessons to take away is that global conflicts today are deeply interconnected, meaning that events in one region can influence political decisions, economic conditions, and security considerations in other parts of the world. And this interconnectedness makes it essential to look beyond isolated headlines and instead understand the broader system in which these developments are taking place, where multiple actors, interests, and relationships continuously interact and evolve over time.
That interconnected nature also reminds us that strategy plays a much greater role than emotion in shaping international outcomes. Because while public discussions may often focus on strong reactions or immediate responses, actual decision-making at the global level tends to involve careful evaluation, long-term planning, and consideration of consequences, which helps ensure that actions are aligned with national interests, regional stability, and global responsibilities rather than short-term pressures or emotional impulses.
Another key insight is that not all tensions, even serious ones, lead to a world war, because the international system today includes mechanisms for communication, negotiation, and conflict management that were not as developed in the past, and these mechanisms allow countries to address disagreements through dialogue and measured responses, reducing the likelihood that localized conflicts will automatically expand into large-scale global confrontations involving multiple major powers.
This is why understanding the difference between regional escalation and global conflict is so important. Because without that clarity, it becomes easy to misinterpret developments and assume outcomes that may not reflect reality, while in fact, many situations remain contained due to diplomatic efforts, strategic restraint, and the shared recognition among nations that uncontrolled escalation would carry significant risks for everyone involved.
When we reflect on the role of analysis, it becomes clear that careful observation and structured thinking are essential tools for understanding complex global events, because relying solely on headlines or fragmented information can lead to incomplete conclusions, whereas taking the time to examine context, motivations, and patterns allows for a more accurate and balanced perspective on what is actually happening and why it matters.
And from a personal perspective, understanding is often more powerful than fear, because when people are informed and aware of how international systems function, they are better equipped to interpret events calmly, avoid unnecessary panic, and engage with global news in a way that is thoughtful and grounded in facts rather than assumptions or uncertainty.
Awareness also plays a key role in helping individuals think clearly about global developments, since being informed does not mean expecting the worst, but rather being able to recognize the difference between possibilities and probabilities, and to understand that while some scenarios may be concerning, they are not guaranteed outcomes, especially when multiple factors influence the direction of events over time.
That awareness also encourages a more responsible way of consuming information, where verification, context, and reliable sources become part of how we interpret what we see and hear, allowing us to build a more accurate understanding of the world and reducing the impact of misinformation or exaggerated narratives that can sometimes accompany complex international situations.
Ultimately, the world today is highly complex, with many moving parts that interact across political, economic, and social dimensions. And this complexity means that simple explanations are often not sufficient to capture the full picture, which is why careful analysis, patience, and a willingness to look at multiple perspectives are so important when trying to understand global events and their potential implications.
So instead of approaching these developments with alarm, it is more constructive to stay informed, observe how situations evolve, and focus on verified information. Because knowledge provides clarity, and clarity allows for better judgment, helping individuals remain grounded even when global events appear uncertain or rapidly changing.
In the end, what matters most is not just what is happening, but how we understand it. Because informed thinking leads to balanced perspectives. And balanced perspectives help us interpret global events with a sense of context rather than confusion, which is essential in a world where information is abundant, but clarity must be carefully developed.
And that is the key takeaway from this discussion. The world is at a crossroads in many ways, but with careful observation, thoughtful analysis, and a commitment to understanding rather than reacting impulsively, we can navigate complex topics like these with a clearer mindset and a more informed view of global affairs.
Thank you for joining this conversation and taking the time to explore these ideas with us. And as always, staying informed, staying curious, and staying balanced in your understanding will help you better interpret not only this situation, but any global development you encounter in the future.